Welcome to Overeducated and Underemployed. I'm Feddun. Today I am going to talk to you about the role of historians and how I think it's different between different fields. And a lot of it you really can't talk about without talking about recent developments. And when I say recent, in the last 100 years or so, developments in the way history is conducted, the way we study history. Some of this is going back and looking at the historical record with a new lens. Some of this is the way we started gathering information and historical evidence in the current modern time to preserve for the future. So we'll be talking about some of those differences, the ways that history as a field has changed. And then we're going to talk about what I think the role of a historian is in different kind of settings, and we can dive into that. So a lot of listeners probably associate history mostly with military history, because for a long time that's really all that history classes and a lot of history and historians talked about. That's what they viewed as important. That doesn't mean that we didn't have a record of other people, but largely shifts in power and dominating governments, and the way that came about was usually the dominant narrative when it came to the historical record. Now, I think there's a number of reasons for this. For one, we're talking about a male-dominated field until the 20th century, until today, really, even. We're talking about a field. There's an old saying, history is always written by the winners. I think that started to change in the 20th century. And we'll talk about how that changed here in a few minutes. But when you look at your world history classes that are taught, even in college today, they primarily focus on government and military history. And that misses a whole complete part of the picture. And I think parts of that are captured by artistic expression from the time. If you look at Charles Dickens, it's a classic example of what Victorian lifestyle was like at times. If you look at Mark Twain, sometimes he can be viewed as telling a real story, a story of real people in the American South during and after the Civil War. Yet these are what you would call historical fiction, right? Or at the time, just fiction. But now if you view them through our current lens, they require a certain context to really understand what is being portrayed in these books. And what happens in the 20th century is, ironically enough, the product of one of the largest wars in our world's history, obviously, World War II. Oral history started to emerge as a field when interviewing Holocaust survivors. So in interviewing Holocaust survivors, they realized that there was a whole side of history that isn't being told. And there's a great highlight of this method of gathering stories from the quote-unquote common people at the Chicago History Museum, where they took it beyond just interviewing Holocaust survivors. That's where it started, but it evolved into just really gathering the stories of everyday people, usually in an interview form, to try and understand history from a different perspective. When you talk about military history, that's just like a part of the story. And I think throughout the 20th century, you started to see different fields of history emerge, whether it be the way history was conducted, such as social and oral history, or focusing on specific fields of study like art history or history of science. And I think when you start to look at these emerging fields like art history and history of science, they really, not only do they not only focus on military history. In fact, military history is usually, I don't want to say not mentioned, but it's certainly not the focus of the backdrop. But the backdrop provided in art and in history of science, art history and history of science, is really an all-encompassing one. And I think that happens for a few reasons. You start to see history of science taking into account everything going on, whether it's conflict and economics and war, or thought progression and advancements in population expansion, or even just other fields of thought like sociology, geology, all being taken into account when studying the way a certain scientific theory came into being. And in the 20th century, you start to have something called constructivism emerge. If you've ever seen the movie Adaptation with Nicolas Cage, that would be like the prime example of a constructivist writing a movie. The idea that you can't separate what's being written from the writer. And you start to see criticisms of science in the 20th century and criticisms of art in the 20th century in a similar way, I think, where a deeper examination of the person, the scientist or the artist, can give a deeper understanding to the art itself or the scientific discovery itself, right? A really famous case of this is Linnaeus being reinterpreted in a constructivist view as someone who was very obsessed with mammary glands and wet nursing, and he was against wet nursing. And Linnaeus, of course, invented our taxonomy system that we still use today. And the reasons he developed that system are separate from the reasons that system is still used in a loose way to this day. There's a great paper called Why Are Mammals Called Mammals, or something along those lines, and I can't remember who it was written by. But it dives into this, and it's impossible to separate the theory from the person and their obsessions in this case. But what you can separate is how useful the taxonomic system he developed, for whatever reason, was from a heuristic standpoint. He may have called mammals mammals based on the mammary gland because he was obsessed with mammary glands, but mammary glands also happen to be something that, if an animal has, it usually has all of these other traits. And I say usually because there's things like the platypus that there's an exception, but if you have mammary glands, you typically are warm-blooded, you have fur, you give live birth, all of these things. And whether Linnaeus saw that or not, his reason for focusing on the mammary gland in the first place was not necessarily a scientific one, right? So, as I talked about in my episode about the scientific method and how it was constructed, the same thing goes for the taxonomic classification system of animals, because if it hadn't been super useful and accurate in a lot of ways, it would have fallen out of use. The scientific community would have abandoned it for something different. Science wasn't even really a thing when Linnaeus, it was called natural philosophy back then. It wasn't even really, it certainly didn't have the standards and peer review that it has today. But certain things fell out of use and fell into use because of how useful they were, or not. And the taxonomic system that Linnaeus developed, despite his sort of weird reasonings for developing it in the first place, were very much useful and have stood the test of time in a lot of ways. And not only that, as we've discovered way more species than Linnaeus ever had any idea existed, it has continued to, of course we've updated it and changed it over time, but at its foundation, the system we use is the Linnaean system. So I think one role of a historian is to really re-examine the stories that we tell with the information that we have, whether it be personal journals, or another great example is there's a lot of debate as to what caused Charles Darwin's sickness, whether he got some tropical disease while he was on the Beagle, whether it was anxiety because of his theory and what the implications of it were, or once his wife's cookbook was published and examined deeply, and you tied it to the times when he was home and the times when he would go to these baths to do a cleanse and eat a raw diet, but the moment he would come home, he would start eating his wife's cooking again, and he loved his wife's cooking, but if you look at her cookbook, it was full of dairy, butter, cream, milk, all this cheese, all this dairy. And one theory is that Darwin was lactose intolerant. And that, along with, I'm sure, some anxiety and possible illnesses of other kinds too, certainly played a role. So that's one role, is to re-examine the stories that we already tell. Another role of a historian is, I think, to inform the current field of people. But I think that can vary as to how important that is, how much the current practitioners of that field should listen. For instance, I don't know how useful an art historian is to an artist. I don't know how good a music historian is to a musician who's trying to create something new and original. If anything, it could be a hindrance if they worry about too much about trying to be original and not creating just whatever comes out of them. But with a historian of science, I think you really need to inform scientists of things that have already been done, for instance, for the same reason that, they say those who don't know their history are bound to repeat it. And of course, that cliche is true for a reason. But I think what's more true and what's more kind of revealing is if you don't know where you've been, then you don't know where you are and you don't know where you're going. And if you are an artist trying to create something free, that might be good. We've talked about constraint being a good thing before, and you've heard my interview with Sloane Simpson. If you haven't listened yet, check it out. But sometimes he would try and get out of this idea of creating something specific or not repeating something that's already been done. And sometimes with other artists like Roddy, they don't care about that at all. They just want to let everything in that they've ever listened to into the stew, if you will. But when it comes to historians of science, I think it's more important for those practicing science to understand the history in the same way that, and I think this goes back to the beginning of the episode, where I think it's really important for military people, whatever you want to call them, generals, to know military history. There's strategy there. In the same way that I think it's important for a musician to know the history of music to a degree of whatever it is they're trying to do. If anything, just to understand all the tools they have available to them. And to think about music in ways that maybe they aren't thinking about it yet. But I think the idea of an artist being a historian, it can be detrimental because they could get caught in this trap of trying not to repeat something that's already been done. Whereas if they're just their authentic self, it's already not going to be something that's already been done. With scientists, they really do need to learn from the past mistakes in the same way that a military historian might need to teach a general. A military historian of science really needs to inform scientists of past mistakes, past strategies, including all of the other things like the tools available to them, what's already been discovered. One thing that I see a lot in science right now is a compartmentalization of ideas, and where we have people who might be an expert on 12 different spiders or a certain kind of horse or a colony of bats or primates of some sort. But they know very little, and these are biologists, right? Who might end up knowing very little about anything else in the field of science, in the field of biology, except their one little thing. And I think this is the role of historians of science, is to help build those bridge those gaps of knowledge between the different scientists And they really should be part of the community in a way. I think when we're talking about art historians, when it comes to capitalism, there's a certain value that art historians have because they can help appraise art and things like that. But if you're talking about the more documentarian style, think about somebody like Alan Lomax, who was really just trying to capture music before the people that made it died. Or even certain producers like Steve Albini, who passed away recently, who wasn't really trying to be involved, but really just trying to capture what the band was doing in the room at the time. I think these people are, or even honestly, in the interviews that I'm conducting on this, I think I'm applying oral history, philosophy, social history to art and to musicians and to artists and comedians. And you'll see more of what I mean in the next few episodes. But I'm very much trying to get the stories of these people, whether they're big stars or not, because I think those stories matter. I think documenting what artists are doing is much more important of a role for a historian of art or music than trying to reinterpret the stories of the past when it comes to I think that has its place. Like I do think understanding who an artist was can help you have insight into what their art meant. Understanding why a piece was commissioned can give you insight. Like those are all important things. Don't get me wrong. And understanding that can have a pivotal part of understanding the art itself. But we live in an age now where there's so much information that it can be lost in the shuffle, and without intentionally trying to document some things like stories, I think there's a chance that there's some of this stuff that could get lost forever. And so I think the role of an art historian, music historian, and I do have a postgraduate degree in history, I think that our role is really to document these stories, to document what's happening more than it is to try and inform artists of, oh, you've already done that's already been done, or oh, that's similar to this motif, or that's. I think that's unimportant. I think that can actually get in the way of artistic expression. I think what's a lot more important is documenting what these artists are doing and maybe understanding how certain things are influenced by others. One important way that we can look at historians of science informing current scientists is with the emerging field of historical ecology. Historical ecology takes a regular historical record and uses it to extrapolate ecological information about the past. There's a professor named Lauren McClenahan, Dr. Lauren McClenahan, who did her postdoc while I was in school, where I was attending school, who took the photo records of the biggest catch of the day at a fishing charter boat in Key West. There were 50 years of daily photos of the biggest catch of the day. And using these photos, over time, she was able to show not only that the species themselves were getting smaller, so the biggest catch of the day went from being bigger species to smaller species, but also over time, members within those species were smaller. The specimens that were caught. I say specimens because she was using them as a scientific document from the historical record. I bring this up because it's a very real way that historians can inform scientists that I don't think applies to art. I think about military tactics and understanding those and informing current military tactics as being very akin to historians of science, where I feel like historians of art and music are more like public historians. Now, public historians are historians that, as the title suggests, their main audience is the public. So, museum curators, monument developers, people who write for popular history media like the History Channel, or even Ken Burns is a public historian through and through. This isn't someone who ignores the historical record, but is someone who digests the historical record and for public consumption. It can be a very tightrope to walk, especially when you're dealing with public memory, things, events that took place during the public's lifetime or even when there were relatives of theirs alive. And I view the role of art historians and music historians to be more like that than I do a military historian or historian of science. We really want to focus on documenting the stories, the music, the influence, the tracks of influence of different artists rather than try and inform the artists of what has already been done. I think having a solid foundation in the history of whatever type of music you're trying to make is important. But beyond that, everything else should be recreational. Whereas with a scientist, I think having a firm understanding of your field is crucial to being successful as a scientist and keeping up to date with new discoveries. Whereas I've talked to plenty of musicians who don't even listen to music when they're writing music. I've talked to musicians who listen to a lot of a certain kind of music because they're trying to recreate a certain kind of sound but add something in or almost create like a time capsule piece. I've talked to comedians who are trying to do something original so much so that they get in their own way. And I'm not talking about comedians on this podcast, for the record. But I've talked to comedians just in everyday life where they're so concerned with being original that they shut out the world around them and fail to then have a dialogue with other comedians in their performances or with society for that matter. I think it's much more important for an artist to understand what's going on in the world around them and the current events, and that might not be in the news, that might be in their life. But being present in the everyday life is much more important than understanding like the history of their field or their craft. Whereas I think a scientist needs to walk the balance of both very carefully. Now, where does this leave historians in all this? And I'm ignoring the elephant in the room of people are very concerned that we're repeating history right now, and I'm not trying to get political, but it would be amiss to talk about historians' role and not talk about the current administration and what a lot of historians, including myself, are saying is very similar in a lot of very substantial ways to the administration that was in Germany in 1939. And that kind of brings this whole story full circle. And so it really leaves me in kind of a despondent, discouraged place where I don't understand necessarily what good historians are if nobody's listening to them. I don't really know what else to say about that. It seems like we are dealing with two parallel situations where scientists and historians alike are screaming about signs of impending doom, whether it be with authoritarian oligarchies or climate change. I don't know what to do when people won't listen to the experts when it comes to public policy. The Catholic Church just elected a new pope. Religious people used to trust their own experts, and we even see that shifting a little bit now. But I don't understand how we can combat false information and how we can regain the trust of anyone when they won't even trust their own authorities anymore. I'm beginning to ramble, but the point that I'm trying to make is that our appeal to expertise has crumbled not only in science and in history, but we're even starting to see it crumble in religion as well. So I think we're at a crossroads here where, to quote the drive-by truckers, we trust science just as long as it tells us what we want to hear. And we want our truths all fair and balanced, long as our notions lie within it. And the problem with all of that is that everyone thinks they're a scientist now. Everyone thinks that they're an expert in whatever it is they're talking about. And when everybody thinks they're an expert, and everybody gets treated like an expert and everybody has a platform. I say this as a random dude with a platform. It really can elevate some of these dissident voices in a way that can be really damaging to our society. And I've talked before about how creationism has been around for as long as creationism as a reaction to evolution has been around, as long as the theory of evolution has been. But I do think that we're seeing something new, and maybe we're not. Maybe the great joke of all of this is that no matter what, people won't end up listening to the historians. History will repeat itself. And that's why historians won't shut the fuck up about how history is going to repeat itself. This is Feddun. I don't really know what the point of this episode was when it's all said and done, but I hope you understand at least what I think my role here is, and that's mainly to capture the stories of these people and have a conversation about their processes and what makes them unique. I'm not strictly doing oral history. I'm doing a podcast, but it's certainly inspired by social and oral history. And while I think my role as a historian is to inform the public about the history of certain ideas, I also think my role as a historian is to just document the stories of some of these people. And I hope you enjoy it. On the next episode, we're going to have Sloan Simpson from the Sloan Brothers. He's going to talk to us about all sorts of things, from why he doesn't play live to how he got into recording music in the first place. And he'll also talk about his latest project with Jay Gonzalez. It was a split EP, and he's already working on a new project with musicians from all over Athens, Georgia, and I'll talk about that a little bit later on. Next week, we've got Jay Gonzalez. I'm not really sure what I'm going to talk about next week. I might just release that episode and let it simmer. This is Feddun, and you've been listening to Overeducated and Underemployed.